In the months since Tears of the Kingdom's release, it seems near everybody has something to say about it. Some say it's the best Zelda game ever made, some take the opposite stance and say it was mediocre and derivative, and I stand firmly somewhere in the middle. Mechanics like Ultra Hand have been praised nearly to death, while things like the Depths region have been called out for being samey and dull. But the one thing that I see reliably get the most hate is the lore of Tears of the Kingdom. And I'm here as someone who totally gets why the Tears lore is a bit frustrating, but at the end of the day, it isn't half as bad as people say it is. Tears' lore gets knocked for two big reasons that I'll address, and for a ton of little reasons that I won't address because I'd like to keep this video under an hour long. The first big issue is that Tears' lore is inconsistent with the lore of the rest of the Zelda series, and the second big issue is that Tears' lore is inconsistent with itself. These two issues have been so dramatized that Zelda YouTubers are leaving Tears of the Kingdom faster than that pheasant that really just wanted to get hit by my car. Stupid bird. And I know that a lot of those people just didn't like Tears of the Kingdom that much, or at least didn't like its story, and I get that. I didn't have any nostalgia for Breath of the Wild when I played Tears of the Kingdom because I played them for the first time, literally back to back, but I still see Breath of the Wild as the overall more polished game when it comes to its storytelling. But I also think that this issue has been made more dramatic than it needs to be, and overall, Tears of the Kingdom's lore isn't that bad. Tears has a fair number of inconsistencies with the established lore of the Zelda series. The one that gets pointed out the most is probably the newly introduced Zonai era, which seems to clash with the existing chronology of the timeline. Another one commonly mentioned is how the lack of Sheikah structures in Tears contradicts its direct predecessor, Breath of the Wild. Yet another is how, even with the power of a secret stone, Ganondorf shouldn't be able to break the sword that seals the darkness. And there are other smaller but equally confusing inconsistencies as well. Now, I think that these issues with the lore are not as big a deal as it's made out to be because most of the mainline Zelda games messed with the chronology to some extent. Ocarina of Time, Twilight Princess, and Breath of the Wild all seemingly contradicted the established timeline in one way or another at the time of their release. This is how the Zelda series has operated for decades. So here's the weird thing about the Zelda lore. The fans care about it more than the game developers. Now, of course, the developers care about the Zelda series. They've proven that much again and again by making games that blow most of their competition out of the water. However, the developers aren't primarily focused with the game's stories or their lore. They're focused on the gameplay and making it a fun and satisfying experience. Gameplay has always come first for these guys, and story has always been a secondary thing. They didn't spend 6 years coming up with Tears of the Kingdom's story. They spent 6 years programming Ultra Hand, designing all the Zonai parts, and coming up with all these shrines. This doesn't mean that the Zelda team doesn't craft good stories, far from it. There are several Zelda games with fantastic stories. But the team can't be bothered to make every new game reconcile lore-wise with what is now 20 other canonical titles when they've already got their hands full with designing a new and fun game, and that's why the lore of The Legend of Zelda is such a big mess. I think that the lore is something that, generally speaking, the fans figure out because the fans enjoy piecing together the convoluted lore of the series, or at least the theorists enjoy it. And interestingly enough, over the years, the wild theories that the theorists have concocted about the Zelda lore have slowly become canonical explanations. A lot of the Hyrule Historia, the book that Nintendo released that details all of the important Zelda lore, consists largely of explanations that basically match whatever the prevailing fan theories were at the time. The idea of the convergence prior to Breath of the Wild was initially, to the best of my knowledge, a fan theory, but it's now accepted as the default explanation for Breath of the Wild's world design. And this is actually brilliant because it keeps the Zelda community engaged with the series because they're constantly theorizing and guessing about how things fit together because in a lot of cases Nintendo didn't tell anyone how it fits together. In a lot of cases Nintendo probably didn't know how it all fits together. So I think that the inconsistencies with the existing lore that we find in Tears of the Kingdom are not too big of a deal. There are already a bunch of theories here on YouTube, including a couple on this channel right here, that try to explain how Tears might fit into the existing chronology. As time goes on, we'll probably end up narrowing down to just a few theories that for the most part explain the issues in Tears. Now for the other side of the coin. Tears' story does contradict itself. Now, this, I think, is actually a bit of a problem. When Tears broke the rules of the Zelda series, I gave it a pass. We can figure out whatever nonsensical new timeline is necessary to explain it all in time. But when Tears broke its own rules, that's where I drew the line. Now, what egregious rule breaking am I referring to? Well, I'm primarily referring to the Light Dragon, and you've quite possibly heard this complaint before, but that's only because it is a major flaw in Tears' story. When Zelda was transported to the past and met with Minoru and the other goat people and learned about the immortal dragons, one detail was stressed repeatedly, and that was that being transformed into an immortal dragon was permanent, and that there was no way to reverse draconification. Yet at the end of the game, such a reversal is exactly what takes place, and there is almost no explanation as to how this was possible. Minoru has a throwaway line about how it might have happened, but that's it. By the laws of the world that Tears established, what happened should not have happened. Now, I didn't want Zelda to be stuck as Light Dragon forever any more than anyone else did, but the way in which this undraconification took place with no explanation is cheap and undermines the emotional tension of the story. I would have been perfectly happy with this reversal if there had been an actual explanation of how this took place, or at least some foreshadowing of some kind. But as it stands, it breaks the world's established rules without explanation. At the same time, this is the only problem in Tears to my knowledge that is this egregious. If it weren't so closely connected to the main thread of the story, then perhaps it wouldn't be such a big deal. I think, overall, there are problems with Tears' story and its lore, but they're not as bad as people say. I think that there's far more problems with Tears' storytelling than with its actual story. But with all the people who are freaking out about this and all the YouTuber theorists and lore channels that are saying they're done with Tears of the Kingdom content, I'm just here to say that I'm not done with it. At least not right now. There's a lot of details in Tears that lay the groundwork for some really fun theory crafting, and I'm sticking around for that, even if lore is just a small portion of what I cover on this channel. If that sounds up your alley, please consider subscribing, but if you too are turned off by Tears of the Kingdom's lore and storytelling, then I'll just say, I get it, but I also think you're wrong. That's all for the day, folks. Bye.